What is going on, everyone? I hope you're all doing well. Today I am hoping to answer a question that I see time and time again in my comment section, and that is, how do you benchmark games? So that's what I want to answer here today. I'm going to be talking a lot about how I specifically benchmark games and why I do the things that I do versus, other ways that you can choose to do it, software that is used for benchmarking and testing methodology in general. So we're going to get into all of that. But first, today's video is being brought to you by scdkey.com, where you can save money on all of your favorite platforms for the PC, as well as software like Windows 10 Pro, which you can get a key for just $14, or Office Pro 2016 for just $35. And if you use my code SK02 at checkout, you could save an additional 10% off any software that you pick up over there, or you can use SK01 to get an additional 3% off of any games. Please hit up the link down in the description below. Now, if you've been watching my videos for any period of time and you've seen the way that I do my typical benchmarking runs, whether it be with GPUs, that's graphics cards, or CPUs, I typically like to show a side-by-side comparison. If I am comparing one piece of hardware to another piece of hardware, or even just different resolutions, I love doing the whole side-by-side comparison so that you can really see the real-world metrics of the frame times, the frame rate, temperatures, clock speeds, everything like that, as a way of, illustrating more information to people, because more information is always going to be better than less information. And just spitting out an average frame rate and a minimum frame rate doesn't really tell the user everything. You want to know where they tested. Did they use a built-in benchmark? Did they, test in-game with their own user-created run? Did they just play a multiplayer match and just spit out a number at the end of it? Then that would not really be a good way of doing testing. So you always want to make sure that you are doing the most consistent benchmark runs possible. And you could really do this one of two ways. You could either use a built-in benchmark if the game offers it, which is always nice. It's nice for a couple of reasons. One, it makes our job as benchmarking, people that are benchmarking stuff for users, is a lot easier. It's a lot easier to just run a benchmark, hit a button, and then record the data down after the fact. But then there's also a lot of validity and reasons why you would want to do testing in-game as well. Either A, the game doesn't support it, or maybe the benchmark has some wild inconsistencies, like Rise of the Tomb Raider. That was one game where the benchmark was discovered a while after it had released, that the benchmark had some serious inconsistencies and was probably not best to be used if you were going to be doing a benchmark comparison with other hardware. So that's why I always do a good mix of using built-in benchmarks as well as actually testing in the games, especially for the games that don't support it. Like recently with Battlefield 5, there's no built-in benchmark for that, and I wasn't even able to get into a private server, so it was a little bit more troublesome to actually do testing in a game like that. I had to load into a server and try to stay towards the back of the map near the spawn areas as best as possible and walk around and keep everything really consistent, because that is the key with benchmarking, especially when you're comparing one piece of hardware to another, is that it needs to be consistent. So that is really one of the key things that you want to focus on first if you're trying to benchmark a piece of hardware, is make sure that your tests are nearly identical as possible. The next thing that is important is your test system. Now, when it comes to benchmarking CPUs, obviously, if it's different generations or different manufacturers, AMD versus Intel, you're not going to be using the same exact test system, but it is important to try to keep things consistent there as well, using the same memory with the same timing, same memory speed, same graphics cards and settings when you are actually benchmarking in the game. But when doing GPUs, graphics cards, you definitely want to stick with using the same system, and you also don't want to use a system that is going to bottleneck the graphics card. So for my main test system, I have an i7 7700K. For my testing, I always keep that overclocked at 4.9 gigahertz, along with 16 gigabytes of RAM at 3000 megahertz. No questions asked. That never changes throughout all the testing that I'm doing, no matter which graphics card I'm using. Those things always stay the same, and that is important. And for me personally, I like to use a complete system. There are a lot of reviewers that like to use the sort of like the open air test benches, which is not something that I'm a big fan of. I like having a complete system because I feel like that more closely resembles a real world testing environment where nobody is going out and buying a Praxis wet bench to use for their main system. I mean, there might be a very small handful of people, but for the most part, people are going to build a system. They're going to close it up with a case door, and that's going to affect temperatures, which can definitely affect clock speeds, especially with things like GPU boost, or just in general, if the system is choking and the temps are getting so high that it can't even maintain an overclock or even its stock clock speed. Those are all things that definitely come into effect. So I always try to use a complete system for all of my testing, or in fact, I always use a complete system. I don't even own a test bench of any kind. So that's really important to me. Now, I also use the i7 7700K, which I said, and that's important because I don't want to bottleneck the GPU. I want to have a fast processor, and unfortunately right now that just means an Intel processor because they are just faster than AMD. There are certain situations where I want to use AMD if it makes sense, if it's a CPU comparison, for instance, but typically, if I'm testing graphics cards one versus another, I'll use the i7 7700K, and people might say, well, why not the 8700K? That's newer. It's a 6-core, 12-threaded processor, and also, why are you using Intel? Why aren't you using AMD? Well, it's, again, it really comes back to the real-world testing scenario, and if you look over on Steam hardware surveys, when it comes to computer processors, about 83% of users are still using Intel processors according to the Steam hardware survey. So about 83% are running Intel-based processors here if you go look over on there. And if you are talking about core count, I'm using a quad core with hyperthreading. And again, the reason for that is because the vast majority of users are using quad cores. Looking at the amount of physical CPU cores on a given processor, quad cores make up for 60% of the users, and another 30% is taken up by people that are only using dual cores. Now, there's nothing here that would tell us whether or not these have hyperthreading or not, so they could be i5s, i7s, could be AMD quad cores for all we know, but what we do know is that 60% of users are running quad cores, 30% are running dual cores. So that's 90% of the user base right there. Only 6% are running 6-core CPUs, which could be, Ryzen 2600 or whatever. So that's kind of the reason that I stick with using the quad core, at least for now, until, those numbers shift and we start seeing more users running CPUs with higher cores or shifting over to AMD versus Intel. But right now, Intel has got an 83% market share for Steam users, and 60% of them are running quad cores, which is a lot. That's the vast majority of the users on Steam. Now, what about benchmarking tools and software? There are a few main programs that I do want to go over in this video. One, at least that you'll see in my videos commonly, is you'll see MSI Afterburner with Riva Tuner. That's something that I use in all of my side-by-side comparisons. I've done a full video on this, so if you want, I'll link it up here above in a card and down in the description below. I did a full overview on how I set up Riva Tuner and everything like that to show the different the frame rates, the frame times, all the different metrics, and how I customize it, because you can kind of tweak it to your heart's content when it comes to colors and things like that. But I have, like I said, I have a full video that kind of details everything to do with that. So if you're solely just interested in monitoring metrics, I'll have a link to that video down in the description and in the card up on the screen here. But for actually benchmarking, I'm not using Afterburner as a way of benchmarking. I'm more so using that as a way of just illustrating frame rate and other types of performance metrics to the users, and just also for myself. But because when I jump into a game, before I do any benchmarking runs with every graphics card, I go around and just play the game, because one single benchmark run might not tell the whole story, and you might not find something out until you've played the game for a half hour, especially when it comes to something like a multiplayer game. You want to really get in there and kind of play the game, experience it for yourself, and that's why I use Afterburner with Riva Tuner, is so that I can monitor those metrics in real time for myself. So if there's any inconsistencies, I could either see that while I'm playing or after the fact when I'm watching back footage. But when it comes to the tools that I use to get my numbers, the average frame rates, the 1% lows, which is, something that's kind of come about in popularity over recent years, because before that, everyone would just talk about average, minimum, and maximum frame rate. Maximum FPS doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Average FPS is extremely important because it kind of gives you a baseline of what you could expect to maybe be around that area when you're playing the game for the most part. But minimum FPS is kind of leaves a lot of room for outliers where you could just, anything could have happened. There could have been a hitch or something like that. The game could have dropped down to 1 frame per second. And if you're going around getting 100 FPS all the time and hovering around there, and then for whatever reason there was a hitch where it dropped down to like 1 frame per second for just a second, then it really doesn't make sense to include that metric. So that's why 1% low and 0.1% lows have become so important. And what that basically does is it takes the frame times and it calculates that to give us data that can give us a more accurate representation to where it is at the 1% lowest of times, the 99% basically the 99th percentile frame times when it is being done during that benchmark run. Now, there's two main pieces of software that you can use and that I use. The first one is kind of the old standby. It is Fraps. So this is Fraps right here. If you've never seen it, I'm going to close some of this stuff down. So this is Fraps right here. If you've never seen it, you could download it for free. I'm going to have links to this as well as the other piece of software I'm going to talk about after Fraps. But Fraps is really good. It's still really good, even though it hasn't been updated in forever. It's really good for benchmarking DirectX 11 games. It has a very easy-to-use interface. You can download it very simply, and it gives us all of the data that we need. If you go into the FPS tab, you can set where the overlay goes. You can hide the overlay. And most importantly, for those 1% and 0.1% lows, you can also benchmark your frame times. Now, when it comes to getting those frame times, usually if you just look at the documents, it's just a whole lot of gobbledygook. But thankfully, they now have, there's a program that you can actually get. I'll show you where to get it. It's over on SourceForge. It's called Fraps, so Frafs. And this is a bench viewer, which basically will kind of calculate all of the data and then just give you simple numbers, which you can go ahead and then just put into a piece of graphing software. I use Google Drive to do all of my graphs and everything like that. But this is the Fraps bench viewer. So if you download this and you've finished a benchmark run, let's say you go into a game and you start your benchmark, you press F10, you finish the benchmark, you press F10 again, and then all you have is basically you have a CSV file. So to get that, you would go into your file explorer, go to C, and then you would go to Fraps, if I can find it. There it is, Fraps right there. You go into your benchmarks folder, and then you have your Fraps log, which gives you the average, minimum, and maximum frame rate, and that's easy enough to read right there. But when it comes to frame times, it's not so simple because you get these CSV files, which are really just a whole lot of data in there, and if you were going to calculate this yourself, it would take you all day. So what you could do is just use Fraps, which is a lot easier. Go ahead and move that over here, and you could take any one of these CSV files and just drag it in. And then what that gives you is first off, it'll give you, it can give you a chart down here, which kind of plots the different frame times, so you can see if there are any large spikes or lags or anything like that. But more importantly, up at the top left here, you can see it gives us our average, our 1% low, and then our 0.1% low, which is probably the most common metrics that you're going to see now in 2018 when it comes to a benchmarking video, no matter what the tech outlet is. If they're if they're doing their job right, they should be testing with 1% and 0.1% lows and not minimum frame rate. So that's how you use Fraps, and this is a really great tool. But unfortunately, Fraps is not perfect, and the reason that it's not perfect is because it has not been updated in forever, which means it doesn't work with low overhead APIs like DirectX 12 and Vulkan. So when it comes to benchmarking those, there is a new tool that is available. It's called OCAT, which you can get over on GitHub. It's a completely free software, just like Fraps. All of the software I'm talking about here is completely free. But basically, you can go over there on GitHub and you could download the executable. And once you have that, it'll give you this little window here. Very simple, minimalist interface. You can enable an overlay if you want. You can set target executables, which it usually will just detect the program by default, and you could toggle the overlays and the recording hotkey, which is benchmarking. They call them recordings on OCAT, but really that's just the benchmarking hotkey. So for OCAT, it's F11. So just like with Fraps, if you're starting a benchmark run, you hit F11. When you're done with your run, you hit F11 again. And when it comes to built-in game benchmarks, it's really the same thing. You just start the built-in benchmark as soon as it starts running, hit F11, and when you know it's going to be coming up to an end, you hit F11 again, and that's your whole benchmark run, and all of the data will be saved for you. And it spits it out into a file. Here, if you go to your Documents folder and then come down to OCAT, you'll find a folder called Recordings. Now, this doesn't have a simple tool like Fraps to kind of calculate everything for you, but it is still pretty darn simple. I have some data in here from Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. So if we open up the summary CSV file, we will see in here that it gives us a lot of data. We've got the average FPS, we've also got average frame time in milliseconds, and then the 99th percentile frame time, once again in milliseconds. And it might just look like a whole bunch of gibberish to you, but you know, with average FPS, you can see right here, I believe this was my 1080p run because it's the highest frame rate. It got 112 FPS average, which I would usually round up. If it's 112.9, I would call that 113. So that's usually how I will do it. And that goes for the frame times as well. So you can see average frame time can tell you a bit, but 99th percentile frame time is really what you want to focus on in here, which by this says it's 16.858, which is not typically what you would see on a graph. 1% low for 112. If it was 16 FPS, that would be really low, but that's not FPS. That's actually the frame time in milliseconds. So to calculate that, it does take a little bit more work when it comes to OCAT, but as I said, it's really the best tool we have right now when it comes to low overhead APIs like DirectX 12 and Vulkan. So to calculate that, what you basically do is you go into your calculator and you would do 1,000 because there's 1,000 milliseconds in a second, and then you would divide that by whatever this number is right here. So this is 16.858, so 16.858 equals 59.3. So if I was doing a graph for this, my 1% low for Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus would be 59 frames per second because I would round it down since it came out to 0.3. So that's basically how you use OCAT, that's how you use Fraps, and how you calculate all of the data. So I hope that you did find this video informative in some way, in case you were curious about how I benchmark, about how others benchmark. Maybe you want to do benchmarks for yourself, or you were just kind of curious to see what goes on behind the scenes, you know, when it comes to our testing here on YouTube or tech websites and things of the like. So I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here, guys. Please let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, don't forget to leave a thumbs up on it and subscribe if you're not already. And I'll see you all tomorrow for another video.